Hi everyone, welcome to video 2 for the Thistle Pocket Tote Sew Along. The first thing that we are going to do today is install the magnetic snap in our pocket flap. So you're going to need your pocket flap pieces. So this is going to be my exterior. So I'm using the contrast fabric, which is my vinyl. And you're going to need your lining piece, and that should have fusible woven interfacing as well as fusible fleece fused onto the wrong side. You're also going to need your magnetic snap. Now, usually they come in a package that has two. We only need one, but make sure that you have the male and the female half of your snap. Usually you can tell because the female half will be slightly thicker than the male half of the snap, and they should fit together. And then you're going to also need the washers for your snap. So you'll need two of the washers. Okay, so your magnetic snap, you can use a 14 millimeter snap or an 18 millimeter. I'm just going to use an 18 millimeter. A fabric pen, some fray check, and a seam ripper. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to punch out the magnetic snap mark in the pocket flap pattern piece. I usually use my rivet hole punch to do this, but I don't have it here, so I'm just going to stab it with my seam ripper. And then on the lining piece, you're going to place this on the right side, and you're going to transfer that magnetic snap mark to the right side of this piece, like this. And then you're going to take the washer, just one of them, it doesn't matter which one, and place it over top. And then you see the two, so you have the center hole in the middle and then the two slots on either side. That's where the prongs of your snap will go in. So just line up that center hole with the mark you just made. And then draw out your two prong marks. And then you're going to use your seam ripper. And when you do this, basically we're making holes for the prongs, but you don't want to just stick your seam ripper in and just go ahead and rip. What I do is, and hopefully you can see this, I stick in this end here at the top of the prong mark, and then I right away bring it up at the bottom of the prong mark. And then when you're ripping, you're only ripping that small portion. You're not going to accidentally rip all of your fabric. So you want to do that for both. Like this. And then you're going to want to apply fray check. Okay, so I don't leave my fray check, I don't leave the fray check a chance to dry really. I just go ahead and finish the installation. I'm using a really strong magnetic snap, so it can be a little bit tricky to take the pieces apart. So in the flap, I like to install the male half of the snap because it is thinner and I want something a little bit less bulky in my flap. So you just push those prongs through the prong holes you just made and then flip it over. Now, if you like, you can add a little scrap of Peltex or something like that. You want to add that over at this point right here. So just a small scrap like this. And what I do is I just push it over the prongs and then it shows me where I need to cut. And I'll just use my rotary cutter for this part. Place that over the prongs like this. And then your washer. I like to use the handle of my rotary cutter to push those prongs flat because I find the prongs really, really stiff, and it's kind of painful to do it with your fingers. So I'd like to do it this way. Now we want to protect the the contrast fabric from the metal prongs. So I suggest covering them with tape, or you can even fuse a little scrap of interfacing if you like. I'm just going to use packing tape and cover those up like that. And that way there, your metal prongs won't damage the other half of your flap. So now this is what it looks like from the right side. And now we're going to pin, you can pin clip. So I'm using vinyl, so I'm not going to use pins because holes are forever in cork or vinyl. So I'm going to use clips and clip these together. Like this. And we're going to sew them together. We're going to start at this top corner, back stitch, and then we're going to sew all the way around. This way, when you're sewing at the curved corners here, you want to sew slowly. And I would use a slightly smaller stitch length only because if you use really large stitch length, then the corner isn't as smooth. It's not as smoothly rounded. It'll be maybe a little bit choppier. First, we're going to start by sewing, and then we'll move on to trimming seam allowance, turning it right side out. Now, one thing also that you may want to pay attention to is thread color. I know some really like contrasting thread. I like to match my thread because it's way more forgiving that way. So in my bobbin, because I know that I'm going to be top stitching with the vinyl part up, I'm going to have matching gray thread in my top thread, and I'm going to have a bobbin thread that matches my lining fabric.
When sewing the flap, use your regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Keep your needle in the down position. I just find that stops the pieces from moving around as you're maybe stopping, lifting your presser foot, making adjustments. I almost always sew with the needle in the down position.
Okay, so the flat pieces have been sewn together. This is what it looks like. Thankfully, the thread is contrasting on both sides so you can see it. So now I'm going to trim my seam allowance. And I usually trim it down to about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so that's trimmed. Now we're going to turn it right side out. And we're going to need to press the seam, but we're going to, because we're using vinyl, we're only going to be pressing it from the wrong side since that is fabric and I don't have to worry about it melting. If you have a chopstick or something to use to kind of push out your seams, that also helps, especially if you're using material that cannot be pressed, then something like this is very useful. Okay, so now I'm just going to get the ironing mat so we can press this. So one thing to keep in mind when you're pressing the flat pieces, if you're doing like I am and the lining fabric is really contrasting with the top fabric, I try to make sure that when I'm pressing it, that none of my lining fabric is going to show from the right side of the flap. I mean, that's just my personal preference. I prefer that it not show that much on the bag's exterior. But if it doesn't bother you, then you can completely ignore that little piece of advice. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the machine and we're going to top stitch. Now, when you are top stitching, make sure that you're using a longer stitch length. Usually I use a stitch length of around 4.
Now, when you're top stitching, it is personal preference. You can top stitch either 1/8 of an inch away from the edge or 1/4 inch. It's a personal preference. Now, again, when I'm top stitching, I am keeping my needle in the down position. That way there, if I'm having trouble rotating at the corner, I can stop and lift my presser foot and make adjustments without losing where the position of my top stitching.
Okay, so now the flap is done. We're going to just set it aside briefly and we're going to install the other half of our magnetic snap into the slip pocket. So next you're going to need the slip pocket pattern piece, your exterior fabric slip pocket piece, and that should have fusible woven interfacing and fusible fleece, and then one lining fabric piece. And that also should just have fusible woven interfacing, no fleece. So again, we need to transfer our magnetic snap mark to the pocket piece, and you're going to be installing this in the exterior fabric. So because I've taped my pieces together at the fold line, it kind of hid my magnetic snap mark a bit, but I can still see it. So I'm just going to go ahead and poke this out. I have tape there, so it's kind of making it a little bit more difficult. I really should get my hole punch to do this. Okay, and I'm going to place this on top. There's my mark. You probably can't see it because unfortunately my fabric pen is a dark color, but I can see it. And now we're going to, so this is very repetitive. We're doing exactly the same thing as we did for the magnetic snap in the pocket flap. It's very repetitive steps. So I'm just again placing the center hole of the washer over top of the mark and then marking the location of the prong holes on either side. And then I'm doing my same method of cutting out that prong hole with my seam ripper. Okay, and then again fray check. And now we're installing the other half of our snap, which is the female half. It is a little bit thicker. And then again, we're going to put a little scrap of Peltex. Place the washer, spread the prongs, and then again, we're going to want to protect the other pocket lining fabric from these prongs. So Once again, we are applying a small piece of tape over the prongs, just like this. Okay. So the pocket, assembling the pocket is kind of a little bit repetitive, but okay, so now again we are placing these two pieces right sides together, and if you're using fabric like me, you can use pins this time, but I'm more of a clip person. Now we need to sew the two slip pocket pieces together. We need to sew them in a way where we are leaving an opening so that we can turn the pieces right side out once they are sewn together. So there is two areas where you can leave an opening. That would be here along the bottom straight edge, or you can also do it here along the top straight edge. In the pattern, I tell you to do the bottom, but you do not need to do the bottom. You could do the top. Now we're actually going to sew that opening for turning, but we're going to use a very long basting stitch. And the reason that we're going to do this is because it's going to allow us to achieve a nicely folded edge in the area of the opening. So that when we go to sew it shut later on, the edges are meeting nicely and it looks a little bit less like we use that as an opening for turning the pocket. So I'm going to do the opposite of in the pattern because I want to show you both methods. We're going to start sewing about here, let's say roughly 1.5 inches from the corner, so about right here. And then we're going to do the same here. So my clip is in the way. There we go. But approximately here. It doesn't have to be exactly that position. You just want to make sure that the opening is large enough so that you're not trying to force the pocket pieces through a tiny opening. So we're going to start sewing here, and we're going to do a back stitch first. Then we're going to sew all the way around. And again, I'm going to advise you to keep your needle in the down position, especially when it comes to rotating corners. It really allows you to have a nice sharp corner. So we're going to sew all the way around. And when we get to this corner, we're going to stop and rotate, and we're going to sew to that other dot and back stitch again. Then we do not cut our threads. We're actually going to sew from this dot to this dot with a long basting stitch. So use whatever the longest stitch on your machine is. Mine is 6. So I'm going to use a stitch length of 6 to sew across from one dot to the other dot. And then I'm going to cut my threads.
Okay, now I'm increasing my stitch length all the way to the maximum.
Now, before we do anything else, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to like to give it a quick little press here. And then the area here where we have the long basting stitches, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the seam allowance in that area and press it open. And give it a little steam. Okay, and then do the same this side. Now I am going to be careful here because I have my tape, so I don't really want to touch that with my iron. Okay. And now we're going to remove the basting stitches here, and we're going to trim the rest of the seam allowance, especially at the corners because we want to get some nice sharp corners. If you have too much extra fabric, It's very hard to push out the corners and have them nice and well, they'll never be pointy, but they'll look a little bit sharper. So again, I'm trimming to about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so do not trim the seam allowance where you have the basting stitches. This is very important. And now you're going to take the seam ripper and very carefully you're going to remove the basting stitches. Okay, now we have our opening. Just going to take out these threads. So again, if you decided to leave the opening at the bottom of the pocket, all these steps are the same. It's just that the location of your basting stitches is different. But it's really the same steps. Now we're going to flip this right side out. And I'm going to use this to poke out the seams. And I'm going to use the pointier end for my corners. Do not push too hard, push out gently. We don't want to pop out any stitches. There we go. Okay. And of course now we are going to press that seam allowance all the way around. So you'll notice that there is a bit of a folded edge here because we press this opening, we press the seam open. So we'll be able to just line up those folded edges. Before I go top stitch, okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm first going to top stitch along this top edge. I like to use a stitch length of around 4 when I'm top stitching. Trim some threads. Okay, so now we're just going to top stitch along the top edge.
So one good thing about having the opening for turning along the top edge is when we're top stitching, we're actually sewing that opening shut.
Okay, and then our slip pocket is ready to sew to the main body. Now, before we continue with any part of the construction, we need to mark centers on a whole bunch of pieces. So you will want to get your flat pocket, your slip pocket, and you're also going to get the main body pieces for both the exterior and the lining, the top band pieces as well, both the exterior and the lining pieces. Okay, so first let's start with our main body pieces. Now you might want to use a different marking pen based on the color choices of your fabric. So you obviously want these center marks to be visible. You don't want to get later on in the construction and you just can't find that center mark anymore. Now, you could use the pattern piece, the fold line to mark centers, but since, it's a little, I find it a little bit more precise to just fold them all in half to do it, but either way is fine. If the center marks are a tiny bit off, it's not a huge deal, so You can use whatever method you want. So fold, I'm going to move this so I don't accidentally mark it somewhere where I don't want to. So fold this in half and then mark on the top and the bottom. So this one's not really showing. I'm going to do it in white. There. And this one's pretty visible. And we're going to do it for all of the other pieces. Okay, so all of the main body pieces have the centers marked on the right side along the top and the bottom edges. Now we're going to do our pocket. So this one, obviously we can't use the pattern piece anymore because it's sewn together. So the snap will kind of cause some issues, but we do not need to mark the center along the bottom edge. For the flap, only the top edge. So that's it for this one. Now for the slip pocket, again, this one is sewn together, so we can't use the pattern piece anymore. I think I'll have to use the white for this one. Now this one here, it's not super important to mark the top edge because the magnetic snap placement is going to determine that. So that is not as important. We just need to mark the center on the bottom on the right side. And then the last is the top band pieces. I actually want to do center marks on the wrong side for these pieces, not the right side. So I'm going to fold them this way. Mark here. And then here, like this. And I'm going to do that for all of them. Okay, so for this next step, you're going to need your assembled pocket pieces and one of your main body exterior pieces. Now, I kind of cut them very, very similar, but what I want to do is place my pocket and just have a look and see which of the panels it looks nicer. I think this is too repetitive, so I will do it on this one. Now most of my flower shows, which I'm pretty happy about. Okay, so once you have those center marks at the top aligned, I'm going to add, because I want the flap to be straight along the top here. And then you also want to make sure that the bottom marks here are aligned, and that will help you make sure that the pocket is straight. So if you have a ruler, I'm going to use a smaller ruler. I think this will be easier than the big one. So I'm just placing my ruler so that the center marks are aligned, and you can even go all the way to the top. And then once you know all those center marks are aligned, okay, and this time I do need to use pins to hold this together because clips are only good for edges. Okay, so just make sure nothing moved. There, that looks good. Now I kind of combined two of the next steps together and did them all at once. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to base the flap to the top edge here. Now, because I've used vinyl for the exterior here, I'm not going to base this with the vinyl face up because even with a Teflon foot, it can make the pocket move over slightly while I'm sewing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew it from the wrong side facing up. And then that way there, the feed dogs will grab the vinyl and my Teflon foot will glide easily over the fabric here. Okay, and now we're just going to undo this, push it out of the way, and then we're going to sew the slip pocket to the main body piece. So we're going to start at this top corner. We're going to make sure that we backstitch a couple of times here. We really want to reinforce, whoops, we really want to reinforce these top corners because you don't want to accidentally, if you just sew it loosely, it might accidentally come apart later on when you're trying to use the pocket and put things in the pocket. So we want to make sure that these top corners specifically are sewn really, really well to the main body. Okay, now our pocket is attached to the main body. And what we want to do now is we want to get one of our top band pieces and we want to make sure it's the ones that have the stabilizer on the wrong side. So there should be two like this. The ones that don't have any interfacing, those are going to be for the lining. So you'll remember we made our center mark, so that will help us to properly center the top band because you'll notice that the top band is slightly wider. There is a purpose to this. It's because once we take into the seam allowance into account, they should line up pretty perfectly. If they're off a little bit, do not worry. As long as they're not off by more than the seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, it's going to look fine in the end. So we are lining up the center marks and pinning or clipping this in place. Now remember, if you're using cork or vinyl, never use pins, always use clips. I'm using a lot of clips because I'm hoping that my centers will stay in the right spot while I'm sewing. It can happen that they do move around a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to sew these together along this top edge. We're going to make sure that we backstitch at the beginning and the end.
Now at the area of the flap, I want to sew a second time because there is a little bit of bulk here, and if anything is going to, any of the stitches are going to come apart, it's going to be in this area. So I'm sewing a second line of stitching, and it's less than 1/8 of an inch apart.
Okay, one thing that I forgot to mention as well is to pay attention to the direction of your arrow so that your top edge should be away from this seam that we just sewn. So I am not using fabric. I am using vinyl here for my top band, which means that I cannot press. If you're using fabric for your top band, you can go ahead and press the top band away from the main body. So if you're using vinyl like I am, you're going to finger press and top stitch at the same time. Now remember I mentioned it might be a little bit off here, so as I was sewing, the vinyl did shift slightly this way. I am not concerned at all because if I measure, this is a difference of 1/4 inch. So what I'll just do is when I'm sewing later on together, I'll just take a slightly larger seam allowance here and it won't show. Okay, so now we're top stitching this seam allowance here along the bottom edge of the top band.
Now I am top stitching here, so I'm going to use a larger seam allowance. I'm going to use a seam allowance of around 4, and I'm going to, a stitch length of 4, and I'm going to use a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch.
Okay, so this top band is attached and top stitch. If you want to add a little decorative metal label or something like that, you can obviously add one at any time. You could have added one in the pocket before you sewed up the slip pocket pieces. For this bag, I like to add one here at the top. Now, of course, I sewed this on a little bit crooked, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to refind the center here. But at this time, I'm going to use the edges here of the main body because I do want it to continue to be centered. Now, this is a fabric pen that will come off, so I'm not too worried about that. And so I want the label to also be centered here. Now, let's not forget that we have to take away 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here. Now, we have to center it between this line and this edge. So this is 1 7/8 high. So we want to find the center for that. So approximately here. That's where I want to install that. So I'm going to install the label, and when I install a label, I usually use the same method as I would for a magnetic snap. What I want to do is place a washer over here centered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I want that middle section. And I mark the 2 outermost. So this is going to be different based on the label that you are using. So you need to kind of figure out how to change it for your specific label. Sometimes the installation instructions will come with a label or something similar, so you could follow those instructions. See my pen mark, so it just rubs right off, which is very nice. Now, because I'm not actually ever going to be pulling on it, I'm not going to bother with the Peltex for this one, but I will definitely add some tape to protect other fabrics from these metal pieces. And this is what it looks like so far. I think it looks really nice. Now we are going to repeat what we've just done to attach the second top band exterior to the other main body exterior. Again, you're paying attention that your arrow is pointing away from this edge where we're going to be sewing them together. Okay, so again, I'm sewing these together along this top edge. And you're going to use the typical 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end.
Okay, it's sewn together, and again, because I'm using vinyl, I cannot press the top band away from the main body, so I'm going to finger press and top stitch. But if you're using fabric, you may want to press the top band away first before you top stitch.
Okay, so we have two main body panels with top bands attached. And now what we need to do is box our corners. So it's pretty simple. You're just going to line up those straight edges and clip them together. And then you're going to sew from the outside in towards the corner. Now, you don't have to sew this straight. You can sort of, when you get closer to the end here, you can sort of angle outwards this way, like this. And then make sure you're back stitching at the beginning and the end.
Now, I often get asked, what seam allowance do I use for darts? 3/8 of an inch seems too big. What I usually do, honestly, is start with 3/8 of an inch, and by the time I've angled outwards here, I'm usually at around a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's what it looks like. So you'll see there's like a slight angle outwards this way. There.
Okay, so one dart is sewn. If you want, you can press that dart seam allowance open. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to sew the 3 remaining darts, and then I'm going to press those seam allowances open. When you press the seam allowance, this one here, I actually clip this little bit here up into the very close to the stitching, but don't go and cut that stitching because that will be trouble. And then it just allows me to open up that seam allowance a little bit easier for pressing. Okay, all 4 darts have been sewn, and now I'm just going to press that seam allowance open. And you don't really have to go in all the way to the end. It's really about opening it mostly at the edges here. And I just find it makes it easier to line them up in the next step when we sew these two together. Okay, so now these are all ready and we can sew these two together. Just push this out of the way. Okay, so place these so they are right sides together. And there's a couple of things we want to make sure that are properly lined up when we're doing this step. So when we're clipping or pinning these together. So the important things I want to pay attention to is that the seams of my darts are perfectly aligned. And I add a clip. So I do this first. Do not start just clipping anywhere. You have to make sure that these things are lined up because it'll look nicer in the end. And then the next thing is to make sure that the bottom edges here of the top bands are aligned. So again, my top bands moved a little bit while I was sewing, but like I mentioned, it is not a big deal. If it's more than 3/8 of an inch, yeah, you might have a little issue, but if it's less than 3/8 of an inch, it's not a problem at all. So I don't know if you can see, but I'm making sure that the bottom edges here of the top bands are aligned here. And I'm doing the same thing on this side. And then I do the rest. So try to get these lined up. Okay, and now I'm going to clip all the rest. So those are the areas where you want to make sure that everything is aligned, and then the rest is less worrisome. You can just clip them and sew them together. Okay. All right, so now we're going over to the machine and sewing these together. We're going to start at one top corner. We're going to backstitch and then sew all the way around. And when we get to the other corner, we're going to backstitch again. Now, I do like to, because it's bulky here at the bottom here of the top bands, I do like to sew that area twice.
Okay, it's sewn all the way around, and like I mentioned, I do like to sew certain areas twice, but I'm actually going to do the whole thing a second time just to make sure this seam is really strong, and the two lines of stitching are going to be a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch apart.
Now, if you'll remember, I had the top band was sewn a little bit off, so, and I mentioned I was going to take in a slightly larger seam allowance, so that's what that looks like here. Now we can go ahead and trim the seam allowance. I do not trim at the top. I actually leave those intact, and I just trim everywhere else. Now, normally I do like the seam allowance here at the top to be open. If I had used fabric, I would press that seam allowance open, but since I've used vinyl, I can't press it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to baste it open. Okay, so now that this is sewn together, we can turn the bag right side out. Okay, so this is what the exterior of the bag looks like now. Now, the last thing that we're going to do for this video is sew our strap connectors. So for this, you're going to need your two strap connector pieces, and you're also going to need your two 1.5-inch rectangle rings. I'm going to take these out of the packaging. Now, if you're using fabric for your connectors, you can do things a little bit differently than I will. I'm using vinyl, so unfortunately I cannot press the strap pieces before I sew them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to draw a line on the wrong side of each strap connector. So these are 3-inch wide pieces, and we need to have them 1.5 inches wide so that they fit the hardware. So I'm drawing a line through the center, 1.5 inch away from the longer side. Now, if you were using fabric connectors, you could press in each half of the connector towards that center line and then sew it. But if you're using vinyl or cork or something like that, you cannot press it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to fold and sew at the same time.
Okay, so we have the connector with wrong side facing up, and we can see that line. We're just folding one half in towards the center. So you want the raw edge to meet that center line. And then I am sewing it in place with about 1/4 inch seam allowance from the center line. Now, when I get to the bottom edge here, keep your needle in the down position, and then you're going to rotate the connector and then fold in the other half to meet that first raw edge. And then you sew across just 1/4 inch past the center. And then you sew up the other side again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, and that's your strap connector at the end.
Okay, so once we have the two strap connectors sewn, you're going to take one and you want to see those raw edges, and then you're going to slip the connector through a rectangle ring and then fold the connector in half so that you have those raw edges hidden inside. Okay, and then just use a clip and hold these in place. And then we're going to sew them together. But we're going to start at one top corner here, backstitch. Then you're going to sew, so you're sewing 1/8 of an inch from this edge. And then you're going to stop when you get close to the rectangle ring. You don't want to sew too close to the rectangle ring because you need to give your presser foot room to be able to then sew across here and then rotate again and sew down the other side with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's what we're going to do now.
So my Ultra Glide foot here, it's a Teflon foot. It's very narrow, which allows me to sew pretty close to the rectangle ring. However, you want to figure out what that distance is. So stop and rotate. Oh, see, I can still go a little bit closer. So I'm going to go back. So another one, and then check again. That's safe to me, because you also then want to be able to stop and rotate on the other end without the back of your presser foot hitting the rectangle ring too much. As always, I'm keeping my needle in the down position. Okay, so no, not close enough. I want to get 1/8 of an inch away from the edge here. This is good. Take out this clip and sew down to the opposite corner. Okay, and then that's what it looks like in the end. Now we're going to do the same thing for the remaining rectangle ring and strap connector.
So remember, I had you base the seam allowance open. I find it makes this following step a little bit easier. You want to place these straps. So you want to find the center, which will be where those raw edges are. So you can still see them a little bit. So you want those lined up with the center of the seam here on the side. And you want to place it so that about 1/2 an inch of your connector strap is sticking out past the top edge of the bag. Now, it can be a little bit tricky to do this and not have the connector move. I have seen this step many, many times, but it really is important that you try to sew this strap connector on as close to the center as possible. So you really do want to make an effort to have this centered. So what I usually do is I sew from this side facing up. That way there, if it moves around, it's a little bit easier for me to be able to tell if they're aligned here. So we're going to base this in place, and I kind of start over here and end over here, and I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I also use a stitch length of around 4 because I don't want these stitches to be so loose that my connectors come undone, especially when I've made such an effort to make sure that they're sewn on centered.
Okay, now we're going to do the same thing for the other connector. Now, one thing that is important is to make sure that your rectangle ring is facing away from where you're sewing.
Okay, so this is what our bag looks like so far. We've completed the exterior shell of our bag. We have a functioning pocket on the front. In the next video, so next week, we're going to be sewing the lining of our bag. This will be the longest video. The next one will be the longest one because we're also going to sew our zipper panels, which I know a lot of people are not fans of sewing zipper panels, so we're going to cover that next week. Thanks for joining.